Welcome. Welcome, Tim
Thank
Johnson-Newell.
Yes, thank you.
Good to have you here.
Good to be here, and I've enjoyed the preliminary conversation, which has got me thinking and made me very interested in continuing what we talked about the last time.
Likewise. So I'm Nigel Polak. It's 2024. I'm president of PACFA. Tim Johnson-Newell, you were president of PACFA for what period?
2008 to 2010.
2008 to 2010.
Yeah.
And so welcome and thank you for being here, Tim. And this is part of our series on PACFA's past presidents to sort of capture the history of PACFA for posterity and for people's learning. We'll do an acknowledgement of country, as that's appropriate. I'm sitting on Gumbaynggirr country in northeastern New South Wales, and so I acknowledge the traditional custodians and recognise their elders past and present. And Tim, you were just telling me about the country that you've now landed on.
I'm on Dunghutti land, which is a neighbour of Gumbaynggirr, and we live on the side of a sacred mountain called Yarrahapini, or Yarriabini as it's known in language. And I guess I have no idea why we came here. It was just a falling in love during COVID, and it's been fantastic, and it's been really tough at times. We arrived as the floods came. COVID was in the middle of COVID. And it was a tough beginning. We had all our stuff in tents, stupidly, lost most of it in mud and water, mold. But it's been, I guess, a refreshing move back towards my 20s and 30s, where I was a bit of a revolutionary as in England. I sort of had a very anarchic Reichian therapy training. Very sort of political, very anarchic, really. I mean, anarchic in the best sense of the word. And the man who trained me went on to become an editor of the Politics and Psychotherapy Journal in Britain, and written lots of books about what I've just said, really. Coming here to Australia, I feel I sort of became very tight in the way I thought comparatively, and it's really now in my 70s that I've begun to sort of loosen up a bit when I feel I belong here, and now I'm on this land. I think that's what it is. It feels like this sort of taking myself away from the city and being free at some level. So thank you to the land, really, for giving that to me.
Lovely acknowledgement of the country that you're on.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's start talking about your history. So there's part of that history there of coming to Australia, but maybe sort of fill us in on what your life and career was pre-PACFA.
I started at the beginning, I suppose. I'm the son of a naval officer. He started as a sailor on D-Day, and that's really formed quite a lot of who I am, him and the Navy. We grew up in the Navy. We moved around Britain and the world with the Navy, moved every couple of years, literally. And it's given me an abiding, in the end, hatred of the military, and then eventually in my 40s, a love of my father, but also a love of men who choose to take that path as a career. A lot of reading about serving in the military and what that means, and the craziness of it and the madness of it, and was going to do a PhD in masculinity in the military, and started it, did a lot of work on it, and then gave it up. I think my own psychoanalysis kind of sorted that out, but it did give me a great appreciation of my dad. I went to an English state grammar school that had some boarding houses, which were mostly for people in the military, mostly kids of people in the military. So again, a sort of quite a militaristic background there. I went to Cambridge for university. That was my first university. But before that, I did what was called a sandwich course, where you did a year in industry. And I chose to work for British Leyland, making trucks and buses, and did bits of 3 apprenticeships, fitting and turning, tinsmithing, i.e. building bodies, and founding, so making things with molten metal. And we had to serve for a couple of weeks in each of the production departments, from making nuts and bolts through to testing the vehicles when they were finished, and then also getting a very good training in quite a practical way of being. And then we went to whichever university we got into from school, and had to go back there every summer for 6 weeks to the Hall of Residence in Leyland in Lancashire, and continue our training. In my case, as a what was then called a cost accountant, now called a management accountant. So I got seconded to offices, which was great as a 18, 19-year-old. There were girls, there were all, it was just very exciting for me as a young man. And the Hall of Residence was my introduction to really what it was like to be at uni. There was a lot of sort of things that went on at uni. It wasn't strange to me going to university. The idea was that you came back for a year, and I did, but then because I was there at the beginning of the finance function in British Leyland, there were 3 senior Ford managers who'd been poached from Ford, and I was their only member of staff. So I had a very responsible, great job as an 18-year-old, phoning CEOs and pretending that I was somebody of consequence, and that was a useful, I guess, trade as well. So I did economics, politics, and philosophy at Cambridge. I got an okay degree, not a great degree, but it was a fantastic experience. It was pretty much all male in those days. You had to be in by 11. The gates were shut. If you wanted to get back in, or if you wanted to get a girl in, you both had to climb over the wall and risk life and limb. And it was before mixed colleges. You had to wear a gown everywhere. I enjoyed my time there a lot, but I was very glad to leave. It was like a bubble of a different world, really, that was no longer really what I would consider to be the real world. I was glad to get away. I went, as I said, back to British Leyland. I then got a job in a felt making company. They made textiles to make paper. I then trained as a secondary and TAFE teacher. I traveled at that point with my wife. We went overland in 76 through pretty much every country all the way to Australia. So we could travel through Iran, then Afghanistan, then, and Burma, India, Pakistan, and it was just the most, well, again, a remarkable trip. I was talking to an Afghani man a couple of days ago. He was selling carpets, and he said, I watch video clips of people like you who went there in the 70s. He said, as a young, I have not seen Afghanistan like that. It's not beyond my ken. It wasn't like that when I was born. It was always in war, whereas you saw it when it was peaceful. It was just after a revolution and just before the Russians came in to protect that revolution. It was a 2-year window of just freedom. It was just sitting, drinking tea, talking to Afghanis who were just excited about being free from the king, but also pre being invaded by the Russians. Australia, I worked here illegally, to be honest with you. Traveled around, hated it, loved it, and hated it because it just seemed like a poor imitation of England, and loved it in the end because of going into the bush and realizing what I'd felt but hadn't had any experience of, which is the way that people were so generous of themselves on the road as we went around in this car around Australia. If you stopped for any reason, even if it was just to have a piss, people would stop. If there were any cars, sometimes you would go 24 hours and not see a single soul, which was just scary for me. And a heat. We drove from Cairns across to the Gulf country and then Darwin, and the heat, I'd never experienced anything like it. It's like, I know how to deal with cold. You just put everything on until you're warm again, but heat. I mean, I'd taken everything off, and it was still hot. And then we'd bought this magic ticket in Singapore. It took us to New Caledonia, Sydney, and then took us on to New Zealand, and then took us on to Tahiti, and then in the end, Los Angeles. It was going to be a big trip. It was a big trip. Got back in the 70s, late 70s, after a couple of years away. I taught English as a foreign language to mostly business people and then Vietnamese refugees. I was involved in, I guess, the putative revolution against Thatcher, demonstrations, strikes, and the like, and then trained as a heavy goods vehicle mechanic. Again, that was to be, I suppose, I mean, it sounds arrogant to say it now, part of the revolution. We were going to infiltrate the unions and then take the working class with us. I mean, the working class, what a joke. Insofar as these guys they were fantastic blokes. They were very patient with me in my arrogant 20s. And they said, Tim, we love you to death, but what the fuck are you doing here? You know, go home, go back to where you belong. It's lovely having you here talking about relationships, writing letters to our girlfriends for us, but go back where you belong. You'll be much happier. We don't need you. We don't need the revolution. And it was just a fantastic awakening to my own arrogance, but also to the fact that they knew more about life than I did, and that they did not want me to help them. And I took that into being a psychotherapist in the end. I think it's like, who am I to tell someone how to live? But certainly happy to facilitate conversations about life, about themselves. I got very sick at this point when I became a heavy goods vehicle mechanic. It was probably 5 years of illness. I got glandular fever that turned into a duodenal ulcer that turned into, what do they call it? Chronic fatigue, which apparently is quite common. I didn't find that out till recently. But it gave me the most fantastic experience of just throwing my diary away, not being able to make any plans because I couldn't drag myself to anything unless I was okay with doing that. And I had probably one of the best times of my life. I was free of any work responsibilities. I was in a good relationship. I had enough money through the dole. I could travel around Britain, and I could devote myself to getting well. So I learned about cooking, about food, about taking care of myself, really. And that if you do get sick or if you throw your diary away, nothing much bad happens. In fact, it's a bit better than it was before. And at the tail end of that, my partner and my 7-month-old daughter set off to go basically to Bali. And we didn't just go to Bali, we also went to Malaya, where I'd grown up as a kid, Malaysia. And she said at the end of 6 or so months of traveling in these places, look, my mum and my sister are going to be in Australia. Why don't we go there and just meet them? I said, no, I've been there before. And despite having been homesick when I first left Australia in the 70s, I went sort of reluctantly and had this very strong experience of feeling that this was where I belonged. And I'd never had such a strong experience as an adult. And that caused a lot of difficulties in my life, but I stuck with that initial response to Australia and I've been here ever since. So that's 87 to now. After a sort of doing various jobs, manual labor jobs, I got friends. I found a room to work, and I began to work as a psychotherapist. Worked as an individual psychotherapist, but also trained welfare workers. I think I mentioned this last time.
So tell us that story about how and when and where you got introduced to psychotherapy and then decided to train in it, and maybe tell us a bit about that training.
So I felt I had a choice of doing something quite straight and psychodynamic in London, where I lived, or I had heard about this training that was starting in Leeds in the north of England. It was run by Nick Totten, who I mentioned earlier, and his partner M. Edmondson, and they'd been trained in Reichian psychotherapy. So a lot of body work, but also a lot of group work. We did it in weekends, and then we would have week-long residentials. It was a very experiential course, and it was very powerful to me as a fairly stitched-up white guy who'd been through the education that I'd had and the background that I'd had. It was a very loosening kind of training and personal experience, and I began working during the training and was supervised within the training. I felt at the end of that 2 years that I wasn't ready in terms of my training, and I went on to do a similar but much more transpersonal training that was based in Reichian work. It was run by a woman who gathered together various people who'd done various things, from Jungian through to counseling, through to somatic psychotherapy, through to psychodynamic psychotherapy. And it was a very interesting bunch of people. And we worked for 2 years. It was weekend work again. And the group work that we did was Tavistockian. So it was much more psychodynamic group work. It was very provocative, very interesting to me anyway. And I also started to run groups around this time as well. So when I came to Australia, I came as a fully trained Reichian psychodynamic psychotherapist, let's say, but encountered and joined the Somatic Psychotherapy Association that had just formed when I arrived. I found some very interesting and engaging colleagues, and we set about forming an association, setting up conferences and so on. I'm just trying to sort of encapsulate that period of time, and I guess because there was a very strong ethics complaint made against the senior trainers of that new association, it really caused a big furore in the association, where we, or not me so much, but people just say a couple of years ahead of me, were asked to be the ethics committee that investigated their own trainers. And it was very provocative for everybody concerned. The trainers concerned, it was like a throwback to the 70s and 60s, really. They just had there was a lot of boundary violations. And everybody sort of, whilst retaining their allegiance to somatic psychotherapy, I think there was a sort of shift to look for something that was much more boundaried, and people went towards self-psychology as it then was, and there was trainings being run by people who are now the conversational model. And the people in Victoria tended to gravitate towards psychoanalysis. So it was like a sort of tilling the soil of what was a good association with a good theoretical and a good experiential base, and providing it with a much more boundaried and I'd say rigid, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but necessarily, but it felt like having a skeleton as well as a sort of skin, let's put it that way. So that really makes up my theoretical background. I did a long psychotherapy when I first arrived in '87 for 9 years in somatic psychotherapy. And then I had a break, and then I did an 11-year-long psychoanalysis. And during that psychoanalysis, I was involved in a psychoanalytic child and adolescent psychotherapy training. So I did an infant observation. I did the analysis that was required. I went to lectures and seminars where we read books and had to talk about those, the literature of psychoanalysis. I didn't complete that because PACFA came along and I got embroiled in the sort of committee work. It felt like I could either do more training or I could do this thing called PACFA and the formation of PACFA, which is in the end what I chose to do.
Sounds very familiar, Tim. My PhD is on hold temporarily while I do PACFA.
Good on you.
So can you tell us that story of I think you were there in sort of the beginnings, and what your experience of those beginnings was, and the different players that were involved at that time?
Well, it was very exciting because from being this situation with psychotherapy was a whole lot of really quite separate silos. The first meeting, I think, was in '96, and there were 30 people in the room. They were all trainers of various modalities and counseling. And then the second meeting, which is what I attended, was 60 people in the room. So much broader base, but the founder of ACAP was there. The founder of the other college that operates, that got taken over by a different conglomerate, if you like, in the end. They were there as well, a husband and wife team, plus all the names, the people who brought somatic psychotherapy, as well as Gestalt, basically all the psychotherapies that were around. The founders were there. It was pretty full on, pretty exciting, as well as all the psychoanalytic and Jungian people as well.
Do you remember who called those meetings, and do you remember the names of some of those original people who were there?
Yes, the people that called it, I suppose, were Hugh Crago and Ruth Sturmey. I know you know Hugh Crago. Ruth Sturmey, Sturmey, and they formed the Standing Committee of Educators and Trainers in Counselling and Psychotherapy. The meetings were facilitated by Ron Perry and Margaret McGovern. I'll put that in an email too. And I don't remember much of what we did, but what it felt like was they facilitated the beginnings of a conversation between all these various modalities. And I just felt this enormous relief that at last we were talking, and there was a possibility that we would all form some sort of association or in the end federation that would allow us all to form a body that spoke for psychotherapy and counseling. The psychoanalysts were very instrumental in it all. They had I was going to say orders from head office, but something like that, where the International Psychoanalytic Organization had suggested that they don't do the same as Britain. Don't allow it to split into 3 different federations, but try and keep it all in one federation at whatever cost. And so they put a lot of person power into the committees. They put some money into the beginnings of PACFA. And again, it was just really great to work with all these people. So names, Teresa Hook, Maria Teresa Hook was one of the analysts. Ron Perry, obviously, Jim Crawley, Peter Campwell. I'd need to look through. Oh, I've got the. Where is it? I've got things as they were. Margot Schofield, Banu Maloney, Sophie Holmes, Charles Wilson, Andrew Little. This is later on in the piece, who was the CEO of ACAP. Ione Lewis.
Want to tell a bit of the story? Were you aware of the of any other associations for counselling forming at around the same time? Is there any story around that you're happy to tell?
Well, at the same time, it was clear that there needed to be state organisations that would become the organisations within PACFA that dealt with counselling. So they were forming. In terms of ACA, I didn't hear anything about that, except that when PACFA became PACFA in 1998, very soon after that, there was a shock announcement that there was another player on the playing field called ACA. And so it came as a shock. Really, it led to a long period, I'd say 8 years, when a lot of the time of the leadership of PACFA was taken up in dealing with that threat, because it was felt as a threat. There was a lot of times being angry about them coming along. It felt like, whilst there was all that excitement about this formation of a peak body, with ACA on the scene, lowering the standard to a Cert 4 with no requirement of really any face-to-face necessarily work with anybody. And certainly as a psychotherapist, there was no requirement that you had your own psychotherapy. It felt like they were trying to come from a place where they could potentially deal with state government and federal government, because they were an association of individuals and not split into associations, each with their different codes of ethics and different trainings, which the feds really didn't want a bar of, really. But nor did they want to deal with PACFA when there was an ACA, nor did they want to deal with the ACA when there was a PACFA. So it just kind of neutralized any movement at that point forwards to recognition or counselling or psychotherapy being seen as a profession. Nonetheless, there was what would you call it? The framework of a tent within which everybody could sit. The register took a few years. I was part of the register committee. I was the assistant chair. So that the register committee, yeah, because it was just.
So do you want to give us a bit of background to the idea of a register?
Well, the idea of the register was that it would kind of give the government a sense of who was enrolled and who was willing to abide by the minimum requirements, and then on top of that they would have the requirements of their own particular modality and association. So it was basically a doomsday book that had everybody's name in it, if possible. It took a long time before it became sort of pretty automatic that people joined the register. That was a long time coming. I think in 2006, there was maybe only a couple of hundred people on it. People didn't at that point feel they had to belong to the register. They were happy in their silo, happy in their association. Who was this federation? What did they think they were? Why do we need a federation? I guess particularly those who were already psychologists or psychiatrists. They couldn't see the point of yet another layer of government. They I think saw their associations as being interest groups. Their main trade, if you like, was being a psychologist or a psychiatrist, and therefore they liked their peers and their colleagues in these associations because they had good conversations about the work they did, whereas being a psychologist and being a psychiatrist was something that gave them their status, it gave them their recognition, and it gave them, if you're a psychiatrist, the possibility of being paid for your work by the government. So it was that was a hard struggle. And all the time, and I mentioned the Australian New Zealand Journal of Family Therapy. There were a lot of people in there who were also, they were the biggest association in PACFA by a long way, and they argued against having the same amount of votes too as every other association, even though there were only 12 or 13 people in the other associations. They felt badly that we were going to charge a per cap fee for each member of their association. They were the biggest association, therefore they should have more say if they were paying for it. It was an ongoing kind of, I wouldn't say a guerrilla war, but it was an ongoing debate, and it really made it clear what PACFA was, which was an association of associations, and that's what it was. And we were going to try and bring everybody's standard up by making the tent quite large, and that's what it did. There were people kicked out at this point in time. They were seen as not being suitable, and they were asked to leave. And people who were in were asked to really attend to their way of accrediting their own particular members. That was poor in some cases, slack, almost non-existent in some. And of course, eventually we got a PACFA ethics document that everybody began to adopt as their own. So I went to that second meeting in '97 and sort of signed on to be part of PACFA at that point, and volunteered to be on the register committee, so forming the register. So that was my first gig, and I think I was on that committee for 5 years. In '98, the founding treasurer resigned quite quickly, and people asked me, because of my background in accounting, would I like to be I'd been a treasurer of account associations before. Would I like to be the treasurer of PACFA? So I said yes. So I had 2 jobs at that point, both of them very big, both of them requiring a lot of travel to Victoria. We had long meetings, 3-day meetings for the register committee and 3-day meetings for what was then, I can't remember what it was called. It wasn't called the board then, it was called something else, but it was what is now the board. So I would go to Melbourne at least 8 times a year for long weekends. I enjoyed being the treasurer a lot, I must say. It felt like the concrete thing that people could really easily get their heads around, i.e. money, and when it came to meetings of the council, sometimes 80 people would be there complaining about cash, PACFA taking their cash or PACFA not doing enough for them. And it stood to me to really talk to that. And whilst I found it very daunting at first, in the end, I enjoyed being, I suppose, someone who did have this very concrete role, and having therefore to explain that whilst we might think that people loved us as psychotherapists and counsellors and we would be willing to put cash into our endeavour to be a professional association, I personally thought that was very unlikely. And whilst one charity did put some cash towards PACFA, nobody else ever did. And so it became a case then of, at first incrementally, and then by a big jump, increasing the per cap fee and explaining again that these were not large sums. I think by the time I'd finished being treasurer, it was $100 per cap. You put that in terms of cups of coffee or a meal out in a restaurant, it's really nothing at all. And I think I then started to, if I'm frank with you, I didn't want to be that for the rest of my life. I was ready to sort of finish with the board if this was going to be the end of it. And I said this to the then president, and because Ron was president. I don't know how long he was president for, maybe 6 or 7 years, maybe. And he said, okay, you better be deputy. And so I was deputy president at that point, and I think that was for 2 years. And then I did that final 2 years as president. So that was the trajectory. In terms of the people on the board at the time, I've named some of them. I'd need to go through and get their names. I don't want to get the names wrong, and I'll make a note.
What parts of those years of presidency would you like to talk about in terms of what happened? You had years of working as 5 years of being with the register, making the PACFA register happen. Still a huge project even now. A similar number of years as treasurer, as years as deputy, and then as president. What else occurred? What were perhaps the key achievements, the challenges, lost opportunities?
We'd started to appoint CEOs probably around 2004 or 5, and they didn't last very long. And we didn't do exit interviews. I don't think it would have been, if anybody did, they didn't tell me, but it would have been good to know why they left. My own fantasy was that they were frustrated. They didn't want to just be administrators. They wanted to be CEOs. And it seemed clear at the time that probably wasn't going to happen, because I think, weren't sure what we wanted. And that ambiguity or that ambivalence sort of got translated into their leaving, I think, somehow. And then, whilst I was deputy president, we appointed a guy called Colin Benjamin. That would have been 2006. So he came in just before the BII came in 2006. And he very quickly asked the membership.
Just to clarify, BAI, Better Access Initiative for Mental Health, which is when psychologists started to get reimbursements for their fees.
Yes. And he put it to the membership. Did they want to have access to this? And they all pretty unanimously said, absolutely. I think there was a sense of disappointment that psychotherapy had been left out, that we were entitled to just as much as, say, a social worker for the work that we did, or an OT who had been given it. And it also became clear as we unpicked all these ideas of ours that each of these other professions had a much more rigorous accreditation process. They had degrees, and they also that went with their accreditation, and they were also often statutorily registered, and they also were a national organization based on individual membership, not what we were, which is almost totally the opposite of that. Colin Benjamin was the guy who he'd worked for ministers of the Crown, state and federal level. He was both a social worker and a psychologist. He'd worked as a psychologist early in his career. He'd been part of the closing down of Victorian psychiatric hospitals. So he knew a lot about these big changes, these big shifts, and he'd become very political in the way he thought and the way he acted. And so he was willing, he saw it as the last piece of the jigsaw puzzle to get counseling and psychotherapy into the mix. So he had a personal, hope, if you like, as well. I thought at the time when he was during the interview process that he was the only one who actually came with an idea of where PACFA might go, and was had clearly done a lot of research into the origins of PACFA and who we were and where we were, and I was very impressed with that. He got the job and very quickly got thrown into this furore about not getting Medicare. He set about drawing up a plan as to what needed to happen to get Medicare. You're probably familiar with it. I might get this wrong, but first of all, you get 0 rating, GST. And to do that, you have to talk to all the various states, and they say, go and talk to the feds. And the feds say, go and talk to the states, and around you go. And we went around on that merry-go-round, he and I. And then there was also the other thing we had to do was get membership of APRA. And it was clear that APRA would not give us membership. So we needed to somehow do that. And I think the next thing that came was, well, we are split by being ACA and PACFA. And that split is taking up a lot of energy and time. And is there a way that we can make ourselves a national confederated federation? And that was RCAP, as you say. It felt a relief to talk to the people in ACA. I could see why there was such a problem, and we talked about that the last time we spoke, that the CEO and owner of the trainee organization really didn't fully understand what an association was, or that it was a democratic organization, and that the PACFA was a democratic organization, and by implication, I worked out that therefore ACA wasn't one of those. And you sort of confirmed that in your comments as well. But we did get them to the table. We did form that organization. And in that process, where with them, we were looking for a way to provide some solid, what would you say, evidence. So rather than evidence, we went the practice-based evidence route. And whilst that's quite a sort of primitive measure, it was something at least. And it not taking on that, if we were not to have taken on that, then I felt that philosophically we were lost in something that had already been going on for 60 years, where each silo of psychotherapy and counseling argues for its own particular modality to be the best or the better. And there's been articles written about that, and I agree with them. And it's like, no, guys, please, let's not go down this path. It's the medical system, basically. There is one treatment, and it's a treatment, and it's not. I don't think that's the way that psychotherapy works, nor counseling particularly. And so and Colin did a lot of research in this and started to make that happen as well. But unfortunately, and I'm not quite sure why, he was a very intelligent guy. And with that intelligence, there was a sort of difficulty in forming relationships with people. He got people offside in a way that he was totally unconscious of. He took decisions which should really have been talked through at board level. And at the same time, as president, I felt that he was worth supporting. I thought he was an intelligent, thoughtful man. And at times, in front of 80 not necessarily sympathetic people, would pull off these absolutely stunning performances of intellectual rigor as he talked through his vision of how we should go. I made myself highly unpopular in that whole process of supporting him, trying to be the president at the same time, and trying to get things moving along in PACFA. So come the end of my tenure in 2010, I'd had 18 months of fighting the board, and I was just exhausted, basically. Colin got the sack. He rocked up to work one day. They'd already restricted him to working 1 day a week, which is what he was paid for. He would sometimes work 5 days a week. They rocked up to work in the office, and they changed the locks. So it was just very painful, and I got embroiled in all of that as well through RCAP. So I too became odorous to the board, and they changed the constitution so that I couldn't take up my position as immediate past president. That was strong, humiliating to some degree. Took me a long time to get over it, maybe a couple of years. And then I slowly sort of worked my way back into, I guess, becoming involved in PACFA, beginning to form the definition of psychotherapy with a number of other people. And that was a deal of work, I have to say. That was quite pernickety work to do that, but we did what we did. And also, there was starting to be murmurings about psychotherapy not being mentioned much in PACFA bulletins or anything. It was always, sometimes it would be mentioned, psychotherapy, but not much. So I gathered in Sydney the psychotherapy associations, and we formed a sort of conference that talked about the idea of joint trainings amongst us. And I wrote minutes of these meetings, and by way of introduction of what we were doing, I sort of, I suppose, implied that this was not a good idea to ignore us. We formed quite a large body within PACFA, and we had our own and very different, not very different, somewhat different idea of what the work was, and that that message was heard, and I was pleased about that. But again, I sort of lost touch with PACFA in the end. I became involved with a psychoanalytic organization called Australian Association of Group Psychotherapists. When the analysts left in 2010, at the end of my presidency, that was a very, very disappointing moment. At one stage,
was there a story there? Like, what's the story behind the analysts?
Various stories, Nigel, really various stories. One was that the government had whispered to them, the analysts, that they'd said that if you form your own association, federation, we will support that. And of course, that's a no-cost option for them. Most of them were counsellors or psychiatrists. And so it just meant that, it split PACFA, and it gave the psychoanalysts a seeming special place in the heart of the feds, but not really. And so that's one story. The other story was something along the lines of, they too found Colin Benjamin, they didn't trust him, and they didn't trust where he was taking psychotherapy and counselling. In 2010, we created a third tier within PACFA, which was psychoanalysts, basically. And at their request, they found it difficult to sit with being just psychotherapists, and they wanted to distinguish themselves from psychotherapy. I was disappointed that having put so much work into PACFA, they would then pull out on the basis of not being accorded the respect they felt they should be. And I thought, that's not quite. If that's true, if that's why you've pulled out, then that's really disappointing. We've bent over backwards here. To me, they're not just part of the foundation of PACFA, they're also part of the foundation of psychotherapy and counselling. And it sort of rips out the heart, not the heart, that's too strong, but it rips out an important part of the body of our profession.
I'm curious about lost opportunities, and if you had your time again, what might you do differently?
Oh, I would probably, because of the way it worked out, I would have kept a lot of what Colin proposed. It was a good proposal as a way through, but also as a structure. Personally, put more effort into retaining the psychoanalysts. They probably would have left anyway, but that's a lost opportunity. I think they needed to be helped to understand that by leaving, they were actually doing damage to the profession, and that the politicians who are better at this stuff than we are would have been rubbing their hands with glee. I mean, just basically neutralised PACFA as a voice, and ACA by the by as well. I would have started to begin the work, and I think it's a long work, and clearly you're doing that work now, which is fantastic to hear, where people start to talk about what psychotherapy and counselling are, where we don't pretend that we're psychologists or doctors. We are what we are, and to be proud of that, because that to me is one of the one of the core elements of our profession at the moment, is a kind of sense of, and how to begin to address that so that people feel proud. I felt proud in the 70s and 80s about being a bit of an outsider. But if we are going to go inside, then let's do it with pride, not with sort of diffidence, and not by pretending that we're something that we're not. And that with that would come a kind of insistence on independence, probably from, Medicare, probably. It seems like somewhat of a poison chalice. I mean, if we abide by the morality of the BAI, we're not allowed to do psychotherapy with people and be paid by Medicare. So go figure, guys.
When we chatted earlier, you sort of did express a bit of a concern that psychotherapy might disappear. Is there anything more that you want to say on that?
Oh, I think we need to, if we are going to be a profession, and as far as I understand it, and this is where my studies have taken me, it's a bloody business. And I'm not sure that we should, or do we want to spend our time carving out a jurisdiction for ourselves. I think I would like psychotherapy to be seen as a separate profession, but I think it's such a funny setup, mental health. There's, the number of professions there are in there, and somehow we have to be part of that. In some ways, when psychoanalysts who had to be sort of psychiatrists were in charge, it meant that psychotherapy got known by everybody at some level, but it was controlled by psychiatry. And then when psychotherapists took over in the 70s and 80s, it sort of lost that muscle that psychiatry has, so forward. And I guess I still don't know quite what the answer is, Nigel. I wish I did. It was always, when I started, psychotherapy was a sort of underground, sort of alternative kind of a thing. And I liked it that way, I must say. No one expected to be paid by the government for it. You could be quite free in what you aspired to, both as a person, but also as a psychotherapist and as a client. And some of the ways of regulating that sort of way of operating were truly anarchic, and they came out in the 80s. Again, I say this, anarchic in the best sense, where your ethics and your supervision was done in a small group of 5 or 6 fellow therapists, and they were responsible. If something went wrong, then they were responsible for what happened. And I thought, wow, that's revolutionary almost, but certainly a good way of thinking about the work, and that you're not just yourself alone, held by a theory and held by a university gained education, but you're an individual working in this strange thing called psychotherapy that requires supervision and people around you to do it. A village to bring up a therapist, I would say.
Yeah. You're held by your peers. You're held by your community, and the safety is held within the community.
Yeah.
Can you share some observations in terms of the topics you've touched upon? What's happened since? What have your observations been of the successes and failures of subsequent PACFA boards and the presidents that have led them? What have you been able to observe?
It was shocking to be sort of kicked out. Let's put it that way. That was shocking, and it took me away from PACFA. When I came back,
who stepped up? Who stepped into the presidency role when you?
My vice president, Ione. Yeah.
So Dr. Ione Lewis.
Yeah.
So you were gone. Ben was gone. Ione came in.
Yeah.
Who did Ione then employ as CEO?
She employed the CEO before this one, the current one. Yeah.
Maria Brett.
Yeah, Maria Brett. Yeah.
Who actually did stay quite a long time.
She stayed a long time. Yeah, she did. I suppose I've said the one thing that stood out for me, which was I think the idea of colleges was great. That was a great idea. It just sort of began to address one of the lacks, which is that there are groups within the Federation, and it provided something around which people could coalesce and cohere. It also, though, underlined that the commercial colleges, the 2 big commercial colleges, were attempting to...
The colleges as the large training organisations.
Large training commercial colleges, yeah.
And who was that from your perspective? Australian College of Applied Psychology and the Australian Institute for Professional Counsellors? That's the one that's underpinned the ACA, or is there another large college?
Oh no, there's another. There used to be another one as well. Founded, as I said, by a husband and wife team. I'll look it up for you.
Yeah, you were saying something about those 2 colleges.
They were both attempting to offer degrees in counselling and psychotherapy without requiring that the way that the College of Psychotherapy and psychotherapists define psychotherapy, not adhering to those, I guess, fundamentals that a cohort goes through a training in one go, that they do their own psychotherapy for a period of time, depends on each modality, and that they hold to the idea of it not just being about something and talking about the theory that they've learned that might explain something that's going on, but actually working with that thing that person is talking about. I don't know how other people put it, but it's either working with the transference or in the transference, I guess. That's one way to think about it. And I thought, ooh, that's dangerous to if you fiddle around with who is going to be allowed to be a psychotherapist. Be careful. I don't know where they've got with all of that now, but I'm sure they've got somewhere.
Well, at the end of the day, you can't just change the name of your course and expect it to become a new thing.
Yeah.
And I guess the irony is that in those courses, they teach psychotherapy modalities. So there's a learning that goes on about psychotherapy without the person ever emerging as a psychotherapist, yes, as it still continues to be defined by PACFA, requiring, in the hundreds of hours to be done, which is at this stage that's the core differentiating feature of a counsellor and a psychotherapist, that to doing and having done one's own personal work both individually and within group spaces.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so that was in the context of, what's happened since. Any other sort of thoughts around where the profession, and actually I refer to them as the professions, with professions plural. So where have the professions of, and now with psychotherapy, counselling, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander healing practices. And so any thoughts, and of course, we've got beyond that, we've got relationship counsellors, we've got creative and experiential therapists, we've got educators. So there's, we've got a range of colleges, supervisors. Supervisor is essentially a profession of its own. Yeah, how have we progressed in your observation, and where are we still seeming to be lagging behind where perhaps we could be or should be?
I think where there needs to be a lot of work done is letting the general population know what psychotherapy is, from my point as a psychotherapist. And I don't know quite how that could be done, given the whole citizenry has been converted to the medical model and being paid by the government to do work on themselves. But I think it's really only in the last 10 years that I've always been asked the question by a youth client, what's the difference between a psychiatrist, a psychologist, and a psychotherapist? And I used to get asked that question sometimes, but now it's always. And I think that marks a sort of backward step in our acceptance by the general population. Maybe it's the times. I don't know how we address that. It's part medicalization of the population, but it's also
medicalization, monetization,
yeah,
and the slow exclusion of psychotherapy and counselling.
Yes,
from that medicalizing, monetizing. That's legitimized by the government. I mean, we've got another interest group in gender, body, kinship, sexuality that represents diversity in LGBTQIA+.
Yes,
and their comment is that it's professional discrimination, and it's overt. The next question I have for you, Tim, is around the vision, or your vision for the future of the professions. And I know you're doing a PhD on professions, that professions carve out a professional niche.
yes.
So maybe you could talk about, how that project has informed you and your thinking, and what that might mean for the future of our profession.
I think because some people have two professions and they take their professional identity from one and they work as another, I think that's always going to be complicated. I don't know what the answer to that is, unless we wind the clock back to 1998, when everybody was on the same boat saying, yeah, we're all in the same profession, let's do it. And we've sort of wound back to something else now, where the psychologists who are psychotherapists and the psychiatrists, psychotherapists have their own confederation separate from PACFA. It's a pity. In terms of the actual work of the boundary work that needs to be done, that other professions have so much more money and so much more experience of doing, hats off to the psychiatrists, hats off to the psychologists. They do just, what would I say? They work very hard at it, and they make sure that they're there to do it every single day of the week. And I'm not quite sure yet, and my thesis doesn't really have anything to say as yet. It might by the end of it, but I'm not quite sure how to address that, Nigel, except that it's a big task. And I liked your idea that we spoke about of a 100-year challenge. I think it's going to be something like that.
I very much would like our professions to be going strong 100 years from now. And I think that if we lost our professions, it would be a major loss.
Yes,
to the world.
There are some well-known sort of comments by North American Indians towards the end of the Indian Wars in North America, and I think it was Raging Bull said something along the lines of, "We need to protect our knowledge, because it will be 7 generations before we come anywhere close to being where we are now. and where these knowledges can be used by people in a general and broad way. And I thought those are very wise words, and I think they're words that we need to also take on. Don't allow ourselves to have our morality, our ethics, and the underpinnings of our profession in terms of training and ways of thinking. Don't let them be undermined by monetization or anything else really that's encroaching upon what we do.
Yeah, the medicalization.
Yeah.
Having said that, then, so what? Well, last time actually you talked about your research being that a profession is based on a skill that needs to talk about what it does and the science that supports it. You also made mention of, you made reference to the Senate report into mental health in 2006.
Yes.
The Better Access Initiative and Medicare funding for psychologists.
Yeah.
And then later mental health social workers and also mental health occupational therapists. Yeah, just prompting you to see if there's any more that you'd like to say.
I'm not sure I would have said science, because I think research, yes, and research that people can understand, and research that makes sense to people. But science is such a dodgy thing, science, and it can be, made to prove anything. And I think that's something too that we need to take on board. That
we don't need science. That we need research, but we don't necessarily need science.
Yeah. But also that you can find a scientist who can argue anything, and that's how the medical model and science has become such a dominant arbiter of what reality is. And because they can argue, science went ahead in the 1860s because they were able to argue against priests, and they were able to argue against mechanics, and that really spread until they took over pretty much everything. And I think we are part of that, insofar as we're being pushed out. That different way of thinking about life is being pushed aside, and we need
science as a form of colonization.
Absolutely is. Yeah, well said.
Okay, we don't need to be colonized. Can we survive without being colonized? That's a present question.
Yes.
So then that's one of the challenges facing our professions. Any other current or future challenges or opportunities that you think might be there for our professions?
Well, one of the things that's happening, and has happened since 2006, is young psychotherapists have said, I'll become a psychologist first, and then I'll become a psychotherapist. And of course, by the time they do that, it's all done and dusted and it's over. I've known people do it the other way around, and they usually say about 3/4 of the way through that process, enough. No more psychology. I'm going to go back to a psychotherapist. I'll keep my initial degree in psychology, but no more. Enough. So I feel that is really, it's about the dying of languages, indigenous languages. It's the same thing. Once you stop speaking the language, you stop thinking in a particular way, and you can't express particular things. And if all we've got left is the medical and psychological language, we're stuffed. And I don't know how we go back. I feel like that's a big challenge, not just for psychotherapy, but also for culture, people, nations, actually. And it's colonization, yes. Yeah. I'm English. I know about these things. We'll win.
Yeah.
I hate the English.
Yeah. Resist the colonization without being
marginalized.
Without being marginalized and swept away by its tide.
Yeah.
Build a boat.
Yep. Well, I suddenly get this metaphor of the ark, and how it was 2 by 2 in the original PACFA. There were we allowed 2 representatives, and it was like an ark that held all these weird animals. And yeah, let's keep them weird and talking different languages.
Yeah, and survive the floods around us.
Yes.
Okay. Was there anything else that you'd like to share, Tim, before we wrap up our interview?
Nigel, it's been a fantastic conversation. I've enjoyed it, and it's made me think. And I'm going to go away now and write down some of the thoughts that we've had together, because it's not just my thought; they're our thoughts. Yeah. And I'm really excited, I must say. Be energized by the conversation. So,
I'm so pleased.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tim. And thank you for your time. I really appreciate your time. I really appreciate you sharing your history and your experience with us. Take care.
Go well as president.
Thank you.
Cheerio. Bye.